With that, let's get smarter with the help of our lead-off panel tonight. Peter Baker is here, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Leonnig, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter with the Washington Post. And Barbara McQuade, a veteran federal prosecutor and former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. Her new book comes out at the end of February. It is called Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. Well, we're seeing it right here with 25% of Americans who believe that January 6th was started by the FBI. That is mind-blowing. I want to get to that. But first, we must talk about this almost $8 million in this damning report Donald Trump and his business received from foreign governments. Peter, Eric Trump says what happened with the family business never affected his dad's decision-making process as president. Like, are you kidding me with this?
Well, look, what the House Democrats have done here is compile a report that tells us something we already knew, which, of course, is that President Trump and his family were monetizing their business throughout his presidency, that they took advantage of the fact that foreign governments wanted to, be on the good side of the Trump family, and that in that case used their money to patronize his businesses. A lot of this money came from China. Now, this was ruled by various courts. The challenges to the on the basis of the emoluments clauses never went anywhere. But what's remarkable about it now, or what's important about this now, is because it comes at a time when the House Republicans are attacking President Biden because his family, particularly Hunter Biden, took money from foreign sources. And the point that the House Democrats are making is, well, why is it a scandal when one family makes money from overseas and the other family doesn't? In some cases, of course, we know how President Trump and his White House handle some of these foreign countries. Saudi Arabia, in particular, for instance, was given a free free check after the killing of Khashoggi by President Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who then, after leaving the White House, went and got $2 billion worth of investments from the Saudis to manage. So, yes, both sides have been involved in foreign funding, the Trump side with far more money.
Okay, then, Peter, you just laid it out. How does the House GOP continue this impeachment inquiry into President Biden with no hard evidence when we've now just seen this damning report about Donald Trump?
Well, the House Republican argument is that Trump's businesses, whatever you think of them, were legitimate businesses, and that there was no real legitimate business that Hunter Biden was providing when he got this money, and therefore it is shadier than, paying for hotel rooms that you actually can, stay in. And that's the argument that they're making. But you're right that to say that they have not had any evidence whatsoever suggesting that President Trump did anything using the powers of his office as vice president when he was in office to help Hunter Biden's business clients or business associates. And that's still the trick, even for a lot of Republicans who are saying that there's no there when it comes to high crimes and misdemeanors. It may be unseemly to have a family take advantage of his father's name, and certainly a lot of Democrats would agree with that. But there's no evidence so far that any abuse of power was conducted on behalf of these business clients.
Okay, Barb, unseemly but not illegal is what they're claiming. Then what's the point of the emoluments clause?
Yeah, so the emoluments clause says that the president cannot receive any payments or gifts from a foreign source unless he gets the consent of Congress. Certainly, Donald Trump did not get any such consent. He didn't ask for any such consent. And so he violated the Constitution. Now, there is not a criminal statute that makes it an offense for which he could be charged with a crime. But if that information had come to light while he was in office, it would certainly be grounds for impeachment. It should be grounds that his opponents can use against him in the campaign, that he is unfit to serve as president because of this. And, a really important point about government ethics, some of this has been explained away by the Trump family as, nonsense. This is just business. It doesn't have anything to do with decisions being made by a president. But government ethics are all about the appearance of a conflict of interest. And so accepting money from a foreign source does demonstrate a compromise of a president's situation. Plus, it also puts him in a situation of being compromised. Does he ever go easy on a country that is sending him money? Does he ever go hard on one that isn't? And those are questions that the American public should not have to ask themselves.
Yeah, but here's the thing. If none of these things, like the emoluments clause, have concrete consequences, they're worthless. Trump's just crumbled them up and laughed at them and laughed all the way to the bank. Carol, I want to talk about that because Tim O'Brien, who wrote the book on Trump's finances, one of the few people who has seen Donald Trump's taxes, he wrote about this today. And I want to just share one quote where he said, "Greed and financial conflicts of interest will certainly haunt the Trump White House if he returns for a second term. He also undoubtedly will feel empowered to freely line his pockets if he winds up an escapee from 2 impeachments, several criminal and civil cases, and a previous election loss." He raises a really good point, Carol. If Trump gets away with all of this and then he finds himself back in the White House, should we just be expecting he'll be renting out rooms in the West Wing for bar mitzvahs and Christmas parties?
I don't know what form it will take, but what we have seen, if past his prologue, Steph, is that every time Donald Trump has been able to jump over a guardrail or blow right through it, it has emboldened him to do more of the same. You know, when he was able to pressure a foreign president to investigate a U.S. citizen and face no consequences for that in his call to Vladimir Zelensky, when he said, you know, I need you to announce an investigation into the Biden family, when he essentially, there was evidence that he'd obstructed a criminal investigation, a preponderance of evidence that he had obstructed a criminal investigation in the Mueller report, and he was able to avoid any consequences for that. There is this view that Donald Trump will just keep on driving right through those rails. In the Washington Post, we made quite a lot of energy and commitment to writing about his violations of the Emoluments Clause. And my colleague, David Fahrenthold, documented over and over again the rooms that foreign governments and foreign lobbyists were paying for at various Trump hotels, sometimes never actually sending anyone to stay there, sometimes renting, enormous banquet halls and never actually having a party in them, because they knew that it was an open secret that the way to Trump's heart was to basically pay something towards his business. You can imagine what that will be like if he's allowed to continue to do this as president in a second term.
It will be a Shangri-La of spending. Peter, let's talk about Joe Biden's speech tomorrow. The campaign ad out today makes it really clear it is tying January 6th to the fight for democracy. But doesn't it seem crazy that Joe Biden needs to make this case and try to convince the country that the insurrection was bad? Like, we don't have to try to convince anyone that 9/11 was bad. It was.
Well, I think, look, Carol's paper, The Post, and University of Maryland did a rather remarkable job with this poll showing how public attitudes have changed. Now, they've changed largely among Republicans, but also some among independents. And it shows that Donald Trump is winning the war of, framing reality, in effect, reinventing or rewriting the history of that day. And that is so that at least his supporters anyway, not his opponents, but his supporters don't view the January 6th attack on the Capitol in the same way that they did 3 years ago. Instead of looking at it as an insurrection or an attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power, it was, a protest. And it was the people who were there are somehow hostages because they were arrested for the various crimes that they were charged with. And that's a remarkable demonstration of Trump's ability to create reality through his political rhetoric. And it says something that President Biden, as you said, has to make this point tomorrow, because it's not an accepted point across the board. And what he needs to do, according to Democratic strategists, is to remind Democrats of the consequences of a Trump victory, because that's the way to win Democrats back to President Biden, who have otherwise been disillusioned by him because of inflation or because of his age or because of any other issues right now.
Of course, inflation is cooling, and Joe Biden's age, he's a couple years older than Donald Trump. Carol, but it's not on Trump. It is on us, right? The poll your paper did that said 25% of Americans believe the FBI was involved in the Capitol riot. Like, I don't understand how this could be. We've had investigations. We have had hearings, hundreds of federal prosecutions, people sitting in prison, people who were clearly not members of the FBI. How did this happen?
Peter said it very well. I would use the term master of the megaphone, a term I've used before about Donald Trump. If you repeat something often enough to people who like you, support you, they're going to gobble it up. And it reminds me of a time when 2/3 of Americans, after having it repeated to them over and over again, believed that Saddam Hussein was responsible for the attack on the towers in 9/11. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth, but they'd come to believe it because it had been repeated to them over and over again that, Iraq was some mastermind and we had to go after them and punish them for 9/11, when in fact that couldn't have been further from the truth. Now, let's just talk about that 1/4 of Americans who believe the FBI instigated the riot. There is absolutely zero evidence for this. There are some conspiracy theories that have been debunked to the heavens. 700 people have pled guilty and others have gone to trial and been convicted. Those pleading guilty in the riot have admitted that they trespassed, and they have admitted in some instances that they assaulted police officers. And many of them, including some of the sort of leaders, if you will, of the phalanx that went up the Capitol and first breached it, have admitted not only their actions, but blamed Donald Trump and said that his call to them and his false allegations of election fraud was what rallied them up to that hill, up to that attack, and to join the mob in tear gassing and bear spraying and shoving and punching and flag slamming police officers, a group of police officers, by the way, who were protecting lawmakers who were running for their lives.
And then risking their own. Barb, I need you to explain this one before we go, because my legal expertise does not go on, my super fandom, go beyond of Law and Order, SVU, and this one boggled my mind. Donald Trump's lawyers are now saying that they want special counsel Jack Smith held in contempt in the election case. Doesn't the judge hold someone in contempt?
Yes, and that's what they're asking for the judge to do in that case. It is. This filing strikes me as far more of a PR vehicle than it is a serious legal filing. What they are accusing Jack Smith of doing is violating the stay by continuing to provide them with discovery and file motions. Of course, the stay simply said that all deadlines are suspended and that no more proceedings would occur. But what Jack Smith and team want to do is take care of all the things that can keep things moving on time so that if and when this case comes back to court, they can pick up where they left off. And so to suggest that this is somehow in violation of the stay is absurd. But if you read this motion, you'll see that it's really speaking to the masses, because what it accuses Jack Smith of is using this opportunity to weaponize the court's order to essentially carry water for Joe Biden. So it's a PR move, and I don't think it will hold up legally.
That court of public opinion, the one that is most important to Donald Trump. Thank you all for starting us off.